Hello everybody, Train King James here, and we're here again with the second of the tier list videos. If you guys don't know, I'm doing a rewatch of all of Thomas, watching an episode a day. Started January 1st, so now we've finished Season 2, so we're going to rank the Season 2 episodes. We've already ranked Season 1, I'll link that video in the description. Probably make a playlist for these. And without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the episodes here are out of order again. I could just go in order based on like the episodes, and maybe it'd be easier to talk about that way. I think I'll try that. Last time I just kind of did the episodes as they presented themselves, so yeah, we'll do that. I have the order for Season 2 in front of me. So, without further ado, we'll begin with the first episode, which is Thomas, Percy, and Nicole, aka Double Trouble. So, this is the first Christopher Audrey story to be adapted in the TV series, and I have ideas about this arc. Well, not arc, but the story that I think would make it better, but I kind of want to wait to talk about what I would do with it. But this story is going to go in C tier. It is it's a very weird episode and a very weird adaptation of the story. It makes a lot of very weird choices. You could just tell this episode's kind of out of place, because we see Percy on Thomas's branch line in this episode, and it's kind of weird that he's here because, you know, he wasn't on his branch line yet. Like, that happens later on in the season. And it's something that I kind of noticed throughout Season 2, that the episodes obviously don't follow chronological order anymore as much, but there kind of is some continuity that's built, but it's kind of interrupted. A lot of the big arcs are kind of interrupted by an episode of Thomas, or an episode with Thomas, and Thomas, the tank engine himself, and that kind of, like, interrupts, like, kind of the flow a little bit of the season. And I understand the show wanted to use Thomas more. The problem is I think, like, it kind of weirdly breaks the flow a bit of Season 2. I will talk about the way I would have improved this episode, and maybe the storyline that this episode was supposed to tell. I don't know, it's a weird episode. The truck scene at the beginning really just doesn't make sense, because I don't know how that's Percy's fault, and the siding with the unsafe buffers changes, and this was just, it feels like a very lazy episode. And there's a couple other episodes that also get that lazy treatment this season, and they're all connected, and I'll get into why, they're not the best. So, a little bit of a ramble there, but maybe hopefully that kind of explains how I feel about this season. So, we'll move to the next episode, which is right here, Cows, and this is a much better episode. Cows, fun banter. We get to see a lot of the characters again. One thing I do like is we get to see Toby a little bit more with the main cast. He's more of an established character at this point. Gordon and Henry have a nice dynamic in the episode. Edward's fun. Much better episode. It's going in the B tier. I don't really have a lot to say on it. I do like this episode a lot. It's one of the episodes that when I think of Season 2, I do picture a lot of this one. Let's see. Birdie's Chase, which is down here. This episode is a fun one. This is one that I enjoyed a lot as a kid. I love the music in it, especially the alternate version of Birdie's theme towards the end of the episode. I kind of like the chase here. It's fun. It's nicely shot. It kind of is a good way of introducing Edward's branch line. It's the first time we really see it in the show, and the show just kind of takes you down it. So I'm going to put it in B tier, actually above Cows. I think it's a better episode. I think it's fun. It's a very interesting pairing of Edward and Birdie, something we just didn't see all that often. And Season 2 has a lot of episodes where you do have very interesting character dynamics that we see on screen, stuff that we didn't see Season 1, stuff that we really don't see beyond this season. Next is Saved from Scrap, and this episode is a fine episode. I think this one's going to go in B tier as well. It's one of those episodes that, within the book, Edward's book, because if you didn't know, these are all stories from Edward the Blue Engine, these three here. this is a book where the story within the book that, like, it works better, like, when you put the whole book together than you do as just, like, an individual story. Because, it's Edward comes, finds Trevor, and then he rescues him. There's not a ton that happens in this episode. I could put it in C tier, but it is very heartwarming, and I don't think there's really objectively anything wrong with it. I just think that maybe this episode, it just doesn't have a lot for it, which is fine. And this is something we talked about a lot with Season 1, has a lot of these expositional stories that the episodes around them help build it up, but we see that a lot less in Season 2. But this is a fairly good one. If you know me in this channel, this episode is going in S tier, Old Iron. This is an amazing episode. And this is one of the most dynamic episodes of the show to this point. I mean, this is a chase we're seeing, and it's very well shot, especially for this time in the show. We didn't really have chases. I mean, we had a few runaway scenes, but they weren't, like, chases, if that makes sense. Like, the camera was very much, in Season 1, like, it rarely followed the characters when they were, like, running down Gordon's Hill, or, like, in any particular runaway. Like, we didn't really see too many shots of, like, these intense angles of the characters at high speeds chasing each other down, or, like, you see, like, the scenes of, like, the crewmen on Edward with the shunter's pole, and it's swinging and lurching, and it's just the shot when James and Edward go under the bridge and the camera goes over. It feels very dynamic. You can tell that the crew, okay, we've done this for a season, we're starting to grow up a little bit, we know what we're doing, they're taking it up a level, and it's just like, I love it so much. This is an actually nicely placed episode. It is a new friend for Thomas, aka Thomas and Trevor. I really do like this episode where it is placed. It's a nice transitionary episode, and this is a better example of, hey, let's do a Thomas story to lead into the next one. This one does it a lot better. It transitions literally off of Edward's branch line. We go to Thomas's branch line. It sets up the new harbor that we're going to see in a few episodes later. And, it's a nice Thomas episode. We see him interact with Trevor. We really don't I don't think we ever really see them interact again. Maybe till, like, the CGI series, unless I'm forgetting something. But it's nice that they have this little episode. It's a little smaller story, not a huge one. But it's a nice episode, and it's another feel-good story. Fun fact, this is the second episode of the show that I ever would have watched, because my first VHS tape was Best of Thomas, and that was the second episode on it, so very early impression of the show. I mean, I remember watching this episode as a kid, and this one did stick out. Next episode is Percy and the Signal. Let's see, here it is. And this episode, B tier is getting pretty full, but I do think it does fit in B tier. And I know I gave Season 2 a lot of praise, but you're going to see the upper tiers get filled up very soon, and one of the episodes is coming up next. This episode goes in B tier. I do like this episode a lot. It's a fun story with Percy. It's nice to see his dynamic with the big engines, because now that we know he works at Knapford, from Percy runs away till the end of the season, we don't see a ton of him, especially interacting with the big engines. We have, like, moments here and there, but here we get to see what that dynamic's truly like. He's cheeky, and he plays jokes. And the big engines finally get their own, and it sets up, another arc. Next episode we have here, Duck Takes Charge, which is this one. So, Duck Takes Charge. I'm going to explain this one. If you watched my top 10 episodes video, this episode is in my top 10. This is a very pivotal story in the show because it really changes the dynamic. From this point forward, the big engines don't just boss the tank engines around and, order them about the yard. Now there's, like, almost a power shift where it's almost more equal, but it also sets the stage a lot for Duck and what will happen in future stories, and we'll talk about that. It's a very fun episode, for one thing. I love the big engines at the station. Quack! Quack! Like the whole thing with Carlin and the way he narrates that scene. By the way, for those of you who are wondering, yes, I am watching Carlin because he's the best narrator. Deal with it. And also, I live in the US, so I'm going to listen to Carlin. I prefer... Honestly, Season 2 is a season where sometimes I will listen to Ringo more for particularly one story, and I'll get to it when it happens, and there's a very easy reason why, but anyway, we're getting off topic. Duck Takes Charge is really nice story. It's a nice. It's one of those episodes that's a smaller episode too, where not a lot happens. But I think this is where both the show and Audrey are kind of hitting their stride a little bit, in terms of, like, how do we work those transitionary episodes that are more, like, exposition-based, that don't have a lot physically happen, but make them entertaining. And I think this is, like, the first, like, maybe not the first, but one of the early examples of, like, really nailing that story, and having it in an arc, where we get to introduce Duck, and we see Duck's first day, and the interactions with the big engine, so I think it's a great episode. This episode also goes in S tier, and it barely missed my top 10. It's an episode that I love, is Percy and Harold, aka Percy Proves a Point. And this goes back to what I said about Old Iron, with the show being more dynamic with the camera angles. Like, we see this race between Percy and Harold, and we get so many fun shots, and the characters just going back and forth. And I love that the race is not really a race, but it's still kind of shot like a race, and there's all this back and forth, and it's just so fun. It's just such a... It is just one of the... It's a great Percy story. I love it. But I do want to bring something up, and I know this happens in other episodes to this point, and I kind of remember it more in this one. Something that I noticed in Season 2, and it gives me the vibe that Season 2 is rushed, is sometimes the shots of characters don't necessarily match the shots of what, you know, how do I say this? The shots of the characters don't necessarily match the shots that they should have, mainly the faces. And what I mean by that is, when Harold's insulting Percy at the beginning, Percy has this big goofy smile on his face. Like, maybe he's taking it and he's taking the jeering in jest, or he's not taking it seriously. But then when we see Toby, you know, we see him meet Toby, he's very mad. And it's a weird disconnect there, where Percy should be mad at Harold, and he is. The narrator is saying he is annoyed by it, but he's not showing it. And it happens a lot in the season, where characters will just kind of have big goofy smiles, but, you know, and I do this in my series because I don't do facial animation, but, like, the difference is I almost never change the characters' faces unless I have a model to reflect it. And even so, a lot of it is, like, you really have to emphasize it with the narration and whatnot to make it clear that this character feels differently. The show changes the character's face, so the narration helps, but you don't need to necessarily know that. So when they don't change the character's face, it kind of is a weird, like, you know... Is Percy actually upset about it, or is he laughing about it? I can't tell. So, it was a weird thing, and this is not a knock on this episode, it's a knock for Season 2, they do it a lot. This is just one episode where I really noticed it, so that was just something I wanted to bring up, but this episode still belongs in S tier. And here comes the Runaway, wherever it is. Oh, here it is. This episode is going in D tier for several reasons. You can just tell this episode was rushed and wasn't well thought out. I mean, this is an episode called The Runaway. This should be an intense, you know, pounding thing. And The Runaway, it doesn't last very long, and granted, that's how the story's written, but it's not a very exciting episode. It takes a while to get to The Runaway, and The Runaway just doesn't have that feeling. And I feel like if The Runaway happened in other seasons, like, this episode should have been really intense. Like, Thomas takes off, he's got a train of passengers probably, you know, he's not stopping, and, you know, he's got no crew, and you have Harold chasing him down, like, an episode after he chased down Percy. And it's like they showed in the previous episode how to do these Harold and scenes chasing down engines well, and this one, it just doesn't do that. And I can tell that this episode, they didn't put as much thought in it. I mean, there's so much stock footage they use. I mean, they're using Season 1 stock footage, and that happens a bit in Season 2. And the episodes you notice it more in are the ones that, you know... There's another one on this list that is related to both The Runaway and Thomas, Percy, and Nicole, aka Double Trouble, which I think a lot of you know which one I'm talking about, that has these same issues, that You can just tell this episode was a bit more rushed and not as much work was put into it. And there is a reason. These episodes, this book was quickly adapted. It's called More About Thomas the Tank Engine, and it was very quickly adapted to create more Thomas stories so they can have more Thomas stories in Season 2. And these episodes, compared to the rest, just don't have the feeling. Not necessarily because of the writing, but it just, even like the production of the episodes, it just feels like they were rushed, they were on a time crunch to get these episodes out, and I don't know, it just doesn't really sink in with me. But we have another S tier episode, folks, and it's going to be Percy Takes the Plunge. And earlier I mentioned that I pretty much usually listen to Carlin narrations, and on the rewatch for consistency, I did listen to Carlin's narration for this one, but, I mean, I'm actually used to the Ringo one, because for some bizarre reason and there's probably a reason. There's somebody who's like a VHS tape nerd or a home media nerd that knows better why. But for some reason on Best of Percy, they used the Ringo narration for that one. And it always stuck out, so I'm more used to watching that version of it, because I grew up watching all of the best of, so those episodes I have a lot of attachments to. And I just preferred the Ringo narration in that one, mainly just because I'm used to it. And sometimes, some of the Carlin ways he pronounces it versus Ringo, it's a little bit different. But I did prefer Ringo in that one. And in general, I do like Ringo for Season 2. I think he's better than Season 1. He puts more energy into it. Season 1 Ringo, he sounds like this half the time. Oh, Thomas, you have to go to the station. And it just sounds like he's half asleep narrating, which he's not half asleep, that's just his voice. That's his inflection. But anyway, getting off topic, this episode's amazing. I mean, I love the joke at the beginning, or, Thomas and Percy are talking, and Thomas is like, oh yeah, danger means falling down something. Thomas is so all-powerful and wise, when no, he doesn't even know what danger is still after his accident. And Percy just follows him, so it just shows they're like two idiots, together as friends. But a nice little transitionary episode. Yeah, and I like Percy and Henry's dynamic, something we don't get a ton of in the show. And now we start to get into some really interesting stuff. So we begin with Pop Goes the Diesel. And this will be our first A-tier episode. I do really I love the opening montage. Season 2 has some beautiful montages, and I'll get to more of them as time goes on, but the montage at the beginning is nice of Duck working around the yard. And I like that the big engines are upset with Duck. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with Duck Takes Charge. Is this episode, Duck Takes Charge, really also sets up really nicely Duck and the diesel engine in the stories. And there's a very obvious way they do it, and I'll bring it up in the next episode. But it really sets hey, the big engines aren't totally cool with it. And they don't necessarily resolve that after Duck Takes Charge. They don't really resolve it until this point. Excuse me. Anyway, this episode's great. You get the really cool introduction of Diesel, and I love the joke that Duck plays. I love that, I don't know, I just love the narration. Carlin has some very interesting narration for this episode, for those of you who know. But I'm going to keep the video PG just, for safety. But other than that, this is a great episode. This is going in A tier. Diesel's Devious Deed. It is so close to being A tier, but I'm going to put it upper B tier, and here's why. I do think this episode really needs the beginning and the end to really support that arc, but I do think this episode kind of is just a lot of exposition, and that could be fine, that could be interesting, but, the shed scene, I love that it's literally mirrors the scene from Duck Takes Charge, and again, he did it to us, we'll do it to him. The big engines still are not over that, and I like that this finally, in this arc, gets resolved, and it's I love the scene that this episode ends on a bittersweet note, that no, the good guy didn't win, Duck got in trouble, and he's being sent away to Wellsworth. And I do like that, the first episode, Duck wins, and then the second episode, Diesel wins. So now we get to see Duck and Diesel triumph. So, speaking of that triumph, or Duck triumph over Diesel, I should say. Speaking of triumph, close shave, S tier, but I would put it towards the bottom of S tier. The one thing that has always bothered me about this episode is it doesn't really resolve Diesel very well. It resolves Duck. It leaves Diesel's ending kind of open. It's just like, oh, I never trusted Diesel, that's why I sent him away. It's like, well, that was a pretty big moment, and that should have a payoff. That's not a problem with the episode, that's just a problem I have with the story. Like, this episode would probably be, like, a top 10 episode if they really, like, truly resolve the Diesel thing better. I don't know. I love the fan interpretations of what happens, but within this episode, I mean, the chase scene and the runaway in this episode, I mean, when you talk about the intensity, it's like, you start off with Old Iron, and then you build up a little bit to, you know, Percy and Harold. You took a step back with the runaway, wasn't that good? This episode, they went crazy for it. And as you get older, you realize how insane this is. Like, Duck is, you know, he banks Edward up the hill, he does his job. Suddenly, this runaway train comes up behind him, because the trucks he was just helping break away, they are gaining on him. He's trying to stop the train. He looks down the line. You see a passenger train in front of you, and, like, every horrible... Like, they set this up... It feels kind of like one of those old Wild Western movies where, like, you have the girl tied down on the tracks, and you have, like, the hero cowboy running in to save her, and the trains come in, the whistles blaring, and it's this really intense moment. Like, oh my god, is he going to get there in time? Are they going to stop? Like, this is a very serious crash that's being set up for this scenario, and even the crash we get is still serious. I mean, there was almost a shot in this episode where Duck was going to move, or we were going to see Duck from the outside plowing into the building, or about to plow into the building. That is a scary shot to think of. I mean, imagine just being in your home, minding your own business, and a train comes running through it. And we'll get to that later, but this one is an intense episode. It's a fun episode. I just think the ending's very underwhelming. And the Duck v. Diesel trilogy has, like, 3 really good episodes attached to it. And I could never figure out what the 4th one should be. Like, I know in the Railway series, it's Domeless Engines leads it off, and I get it. But I kind of think I think that story works fine on its own. Like, I don't think you need Domeless Engines to set up this. I've always wanted a story to wrap up and solve Diesel. I've done it in my own series, and other people have done it. You know, maybe one day I'll come up with, like, a classic story to kind of explain what happened to Diesel when Duck was away. Maybe I'll do that. That'll be fun to do. That'd be a fun project. But yeah, S-tier episode for sure. Man, this is going on for quite some time. You could tell I like Season 2 a lot more than I like Season 1. But we're going to tone it down here, because we have to talk about Better Late Than Never. And I talked about I'll talk about the good of this episode first, and I'll talk about the bad. The montage at the beginning, I love. I love the music. I love the slow shots and the random consists that cross the viaduct. Like, there's a train that Edward pulls that's like 2 red coaches, a log car, and a couple trucks, and a salt van, and I'm like, more of that! Like, that's fun. That's like the one time I think we really see like a mixed train in the show. But this episode is lazy, and it has some... there's another good line. I love the banter between Thomas and Henry. It's like, oh, you know, what happened if I, like, rushed across the viaduct? You know, you wouldn't have passengers at all. And it's like, what would you do then? Thomas, like, run my train on time. I'm like, jeez, Thomas. Like, that's kind of morbid of you. And that's something that is very interesting in Thomas. Like, Thomas this season is a lot more edgy, a lot more impatient, and I love it. I love that edge to him as a character. He's a lot more fun here. I mean, this episode, there are some good Thomas moments, and he gets some very angry moments, but this episode is, once again, just another lazy episode, a lot of stock footage, and I would be fine if it was, like, Season 2 stock footage, but it's Season 1, and it's just... Ugh. When you do that, it tells me you don't care as much about the stories as, you know, or you didn't put as much effort into it. It's like, I would rather the show do, like, 23 episodes in a season rather than trying to meet a quota if they could. I know they don't. I know they have to because, you know, television standards and whatnot. But it's a frustrating episode because it's not a bad story. It's bland and boring, but very lazy. But I don't think it's completely terrible. There are some good moments that redeem it. Donald and Douglas. Where is it? Here it is. This episode actually used to scare me. Not specifically for the brake van crash, and I couldn't put my finger on it why this episode creeped me out as a kid. And I think I know what it is. for so much of the episode, it's really, we're just with Donald and Douglas around Tidmouth. We don't see the other characters interacting with them. Like, we see Thomas briefly in the beginning, and then for like 2 minutes of the episode, we don't see anyone else until the James scene where he's complaining about pulling the goods trains, and then we see Douglas with the other engines. And I always loved, actually, I'm going to move this episode ahead of Pop Goes the Diesel. I always loved the looks that Gordon and Henry had. Season 2 had some very weird faces. I love, my little headcanon for their smiles in that scene as they're making fun of James is they have those awkward smiles in front of Douglas, not necessarily because they find it funny what he says, but also because they're still scared of him because of the events of the missing coach, which I still think they should have made that episode, because I guarantee they would have put more effort into that episode than they did for, you know, the episodes down here, in my opinion, but that's just me. I'm going to be honest. But yeah, this episode's great. You have 2 awesome crashes. I mean, how many episodes do you have, especially at this point of the show, where you get 2 crashes in an episode? And not just like little ones, like 2 pretty significant ones. I mean, I love the morbid shot at the end where, you know, after Douglas smashes the brake fan, you could tell this is like a David Mitton type thing. Like, this is a pretty cool joke. You like the spiteful brake fan's disheveled face with a black eye just casually being lifted off screen, and Douglas has like this big smirk on his face. Like, maybe that's one of those times where maybe he should be sad. I don't know, but I kind of, I don't know. I like that little morbidness there. I think that's kind of fun. Thomas Comes to Breakfast, another banger, great episode. I skipped ahead. I skipped ahead of one of my favorites, actually. The Deputation's gonna go here. I'm gonna leave Thomas Comes to Breakfast here. I'll come back to it in a second. My eyes are, like, trying to find episodes and go in order. Oh, no. I grabbed the wrong one. You can tell I'm doing this at, like, almost 1 in the morning, so I am not focused. This is a funny section of the video. Okay. We are together. The Deputation. We got it right now, everyone. One of my favorite episodes of the show. I love the story in it, and again, it's another episode where a lot of the story's exposition, but the dialogue's really interesting. The characters, again, we see, like, Percy hanging out with Duck in the big engines and the Scots, and I think it's kind of like, we get some great lines. Like, I love the dialogue once Percy comes back from talking to Edward. He's like, you know, the fact that Edward says we need a depot station. Gord's like, of course. Now the question is, what is desperation? And it's like, that whole scene is funny because it's just like no one knows what the hell they're doing. They're idiots. And I like that the show is like they're trains. They don't understand these things, and I like when the show leans into that. Like, Audrey has these episodes where it's like the engine's handling human things, and it's like, well, they're engines now. It's like, how do they understand what a depot... Like, talking back to the Fat Controller. I mean, they did it, like, the big engines did it once, and they went on strike, and it went horribly. And, like, earlier in this season, you know... we have, like, moments where the characters do go against the, Fat Controller and whatnot, so you have it happen here, and I think it's just a fun, story to wrap up that little Donald and Douglas arc. So, Thomas Comes to Breakfast is breakfast. Sometimes I cannot say the word breakfast. Okay, is a great episode. You know, I love this episode. Again, we talk about a character crashing into a house, you know, making destruction and whatnot. This episode does use stock footage too, mainly for the beginning, but I kind of forget that it's stock footage because I don't care. And it's like, one shot is fine, but when it happens a couple of times and it's like a lot of your transition scenes are it's like, okay, like, we could have shot this, maybe. I don't know. But I do like this episode a lot. I like that again, it's based off the Railway series. I like that we get to see Donald and Douglas again immediately after the debut episode, that they've really settled in. I will say the show overcomplicates this episode, because if you watch Thomas's path, he goes out the shed the opposite direction, goes like somewhere out of the yard, and then comes back around, passes his own shed again, and then hits the house. And it's like, maybe just some of that's just the set design and they didn't think about it, but in my honest opinion, what they should have done, you know, is, this is just me being honest about it, if they had shot it like at Farquhar, and obviously they didn't use Farquhar this season, but if they used Farquhar correctly, which I think Tidmouth was supposed to be a substitute for it. I mean, most of the time when we get shots at Tidmouth, it is just Thomas. When we see the bigger engines, it's predominantly at Knapford, which is weird, but, you know, that's just me. Anyway, but at Farquhar, Thomas literally leaves his shed and rolls forward like 500 feet, and then he crashes into the house. Like, it's like that. You know, but it's fine. It's a nitpick. It's fine. I don't care. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't ruin the episode for me. But it's a fun one nonetheless. Okay, and we get to Daisy. It's another one of those... this episode is kind of... It's an iconic episode, not a lot to it. I'm going to put it in B tier, but low B tier. You know, there's some questionable stuff about how the show adapted Daisy, and I'm not going to get into that too much here. But I will say that, I don't know, this episode is just kind of boring. I mean, we are pretty much around Elsbridge the entire episode, with, like, very little footage anywhere else. So, it's kind of a boring set, kind of a boring scene. We're gonna go to Percy's predicament. Love this episode. We come off of an episode where it's a lot of talking, and the dialogue not as interesting as other episodes, but here we get into one where it's like, you get some really nice dialogue, you get really good, you know, accident sequence, and it's a really nice crash. I mean, the brake van just gets obliterated, and, you know, it always confused me. Like, I always, like, I used to think Percy went on top of the brake van, but no, he goes on top of another truck after the brake van. Like, that's how intense, that's how hard Percy hit that brake van. Like, that's a pretty intense crash. Anyway, so he destroys a couple trucks, and it's a fun episode. I'm going to try to speed up because we've been here for a while. Let's see, I believe the next episode should be the Diesel, right? Yes, the Diesel. Another one of my favorites. I think I ranked it here. The Diesel. I love that this episode is fun. You know, it's kind of got that same thing going that Donald and Douglas / Brake Van has going for it, where we don't really meet. We don't see another character that we know in this episode, like Edward, until like the very end, and we get introduced very thoroughly to Bill and Ben, and it's fun. We get to see the China Clay Works. They're fun. And I love this whole misunderstanding of like disease and Diesel. I like that. I love the scene where they're like tricking them, and I know technically they do it wrong, but I kind of like the way they do it in the show better. It's just, I don't know. I think it's almost more insane in a way. Wrong Road, a really nice episode. I love the shots in this episode, especially the night ones. Really beautiful footage, obviously, in this episode. But yeah, Wrong Road is a banger. Not much to say. This episode does a lot right. I just love all the characters in it. And if you didn't know, my favorite Railway Series book is Mainline Engine, so a lot of these stories are my favorites from that book, obviously. So I like these episodes a lot. They're adapted pretty well. I just wish they adapted Buzz 2 alongside them, but I mean, they do. They just do it a season later. Edward's Exploit, S tier. I don't think I have to say anything else. This episode is amazing. I mean, these S tier episodes, I don't know where to put it. This is like one of the best episodes of the show. I'm going to put it here. I really do like it. I don't care that they didn't break Edward. I kind of get why they didn't do that. It would be kind of hard to do that really successfully. So, I'm fine with that. Alright. Now we have Ghost Train. And before I rank it, which I think you guys can figure out where I would put it, but Ghost Train really should have been tied to Thomas, Percy, and Nicole. And hear me out. So Thomas, Percy, and Nicole is an episode where Thomas and Percy feud. And the episode just kind of quickly resolves that feud, which I didn't really like that. The Railway Series book has it continue through the book, but like the two stories barely talk about it. And then the final story, Drip Tank, which wasn't adapted, was supposed to resolve it. And I wish the show did adapt it, because then, instead of adapting these two episodes, you adapt these two episodes, obviously, and you use this argument between Thomas and Percy that starts here to lead into Ghost Train, right? Where Thomas kind of tells Percy he's being silly and tells him off, and then Percy pranks him. And then Thomas is still pissed at Percy in Woolly Bear. And then you wrap it up by adapting Drip Tank, and I think that would be a fine episode. I assume they didn't want people, and I guess they didn't want kids calling each other drips, which I don't know, that clearly hasn't aged, like, well, because that's not really an insult anymore, so I guess it wouldn't have been that bad. Man. These S tier season 2 episodes are hard, and I know there's somebody like, well, you put Duck Takes Charge ahead of it, and like, well, deal with it, this is my channel. I'm gonna put Ghost Train here. I love this episode. I mean, I love Thomas in this episode, because again, he's such an a-hole, especially at the, like, towards the end when Toby reveals, like, he's been in an accident and Thomas just doesn't care. Like, his friend could be in serious trouble and he just doesn't care at all. He's like, botheration, now I'll be late and whatnot, but it's a fun episode. Woolly Bear is another fun episode. I will put this in A tier as well. Just another fun story. This was not one I grew up on. I had to see this episode. I think I saw it for the first time on Sprout, but I did like this episode a lot. Really fun. I don't really have much more to say on it. If you were around my channel, obviously, around Christmas, you saw an adaptation that I did of Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree. And I've actually done a remake and an adaptation of this story. It is my favorite Christmas story from Thomas. I think I gotta put it at the end of S tier, but like, I also, these episodes are so hard to rank. I think I gotta put it like right here. I don't know, like, S tier could honestly extend to like all of these episodes depending on mood, but I think right now I gotta put it here. It's a fun episode. I think it's adapted pretty nicely. It's actually interesting. They kind of show what happened to Thomas. If you read the book, they actually don't reveal what happened to Thomas in the book, like where he went, why is he missing. So I do think that's kind of interesting. They cut some elements out, obviously, for time, which the elements they cut I'm fine with, but it's a very nice story. It's my favorite, you know, it's a nice, again, ensemble episode. My only real issue, there's like 2 issues I have with this episode, and they're both minor gripes, and they have to do with the party scene at the end. Number 1, why is Diesel there? Like, what did he do to deserve, like, a Christmas party invitation? Like, I don't know, what is he even doing here? I know why he's there. It's like, hey, here's all the models from the season, here's all the new characters spread out. Like, I get that's why he's there, but, like, that was weird. And then, there's a shot where, like, when after Santa arrives, and we see Thomas, he's, like, next to Santa, but, like, the entire scene is, like, he's not where he was for the rest of the scene. So I guess this maybe was, like, oh, crap, we need to get another shot. And it's, like, just put Thomas here. It's, like, even, like, at Tidmouth, it used to be, like, Gordon, Boko, and Henry under the station. And in this shot, it's just Edward. And then Thomas is next to Harold, but he's way away from where he was next to Percy and James. So that was weird. But anyway, I digress. Those are just, like, 2 minor gripes I have. But anyway, that's the Season 2 tier list, so a lot of S tier and A tier this season. A lot of my favorite episodes of the show come from the season, and really then, too, the B tier episodes really are fun to watch. So these are the ones I go to a lot, and you can clearly see the stories I just didn't enjoy as much. They all have something in common. They come from the same book, and I'm not really somebody who doesn't like Christopher. That's a double negative. I do like Christopher's writing. This is just not really a strong book from him. And I think the episodes are adapted even worse than, like, the book is written. It just gives me the vibes of being rushed in what the show and the quality it's put out the rest of the season. I mean, these episodes I could even put down a tier if I wanted to based on this season. But I'll be nice and put them here. So with that, this is Train King James. I'll see you guys in about a month for the Season 3 tier list video. I am getting really excited doing these. I love rewatching the show and noticing little things I haven't really seen before or seen in a while. Noticing trends with, like, certain plot lines growing. Because, you know, Thomas isn't really a show that's, like, cyclical where it builds upon itself in terms of, like, continuity throughout the entire show. And you can kind of watch any episode whenever you want, with certain restrictions, but I think, like, now, with Thomas, it is, especially, I think, like, now going through the show in this order, it's actually kind of interesting to see the island grow, and we see more areas, and we meet new characters, so I think it's fun. It's kind of like starting anew again. I've never really watched the show all the way in order, so we'll see what happens as we continue on to Season 3. This is Train King James, signing off.